Welcome back, sports fans. So, apparently it's Friday right now, unless you felt like watching this early, Hermione. And we're on our day 5, I guess, of the campus shutdown. So, by now I've hopefully figured out how to give you guys a quiz. Yep, we'll see how that goes. Okay. So, maybe it's probably just a homework worksheet you guys turn in, kind of like the other things. And we're doing nutrient cycles now. This is a longer one, so let's get to it. Remember, draw up your PowerPoint and put it over here so you can follow along. So we're going to go through the water cycle, including inputs and outputs, going through the phosphorus, nitrogen, and carbon cycles. We're going to have major reservoirs, then outputs and inputs, fluxes and such. Really, I want you to know where the carbon, where the nitrogen, where the phosphorus, where the water is going. Because you track that, you're really tracking the movement of, mass, biomass. So we've done energy already. Now let's do matter. Give an example of how animals move nutrients. I mean, there are a couple of feces and such. Fungi making nutrients available, that's a mutualism. And one human impact on each cycle, because you can't just have it without a human getting involved somehow. You may notice my cough is getting worse. That's because I have to project through the device to your home, which means I have to talk more, which means I, a little more. So it's not because I'm dying here. Don't get your hopes up. Okay, that was okay. Advanced slide. All right, water cycle. This is pretty simple and straightforward, and if you haven't had it in high school, let's have it now. Most of the water is locked up in oceans. It evaporates, clouds, precip, on here rain, onto land, so that will evaporate. Some of that evaporation is going to go through plants. So plants will put their roots into the soil, they will draw up the water, and they will give it off through the leaves in something called evapotranspiration. Now what can happen with this part of the cycle is it can evaporate from plants, form clouds, rain, and evaporate from plants again. This is kind of what happens in the Amazon rainforest. It'll evaporate from the plants, and it will rain down, the plants will take it up again and just cycle the water without needing to go to the ocean. Eventually it will leave by the Amazon, but over certain parts of the world, this can actually go on for a substantial amount of time without much more in the way of input. So you can move water up and down and around in such a way. It's dependent on the plants though. It's really dependent on the presence of the plants, which is why removing plants, removing trees, so deforestation actually decreases the amount of rainfall in a region because they're no longer doing evapotranspiration, and the water will simply run off and go through groundwater. Now, groundwater in this case runoff is just runoff. I mean, you have rainfall in a Walmart parking lot, it goes into a drain, it goes out to the drain, it goes out into the bay, carrying whatever things it found in the runoff, oil and whatnot. So that's one type of runoff, streams and whatnot coming off of rocks. But a lot of it's going to percolate down to the groundwater. And that really depends on what type of soil we have. So the type of soil we have around here is this Nisqually sandy loam. Some of it has the components of logs and wood and stuff. And remember, wood is made to hold water. It's these vascular tissues. So even as it decomposes, it swells up kind of like a sponge and will hold on to the water for longer. This is a good reason to allow decaying biomass to just decay in an ecosystem, because that's holding onto the water, allowing the trees to access it during the summer, which evaporates, comes back down as rain. So the amount of biomass in an ecosystem retaining water changes the amount of rainfall by allowing it's to stick here as groundwater, maybe coming back into the plants, going back into the clouds, coming back as rain. This is a good reason not to deforest large amounts of land. This is one reason that not deforesting, but deplaning, that's not a word, taking out the plants of the prairies enable the Dust Bowl. So it enabled and enhanced the Dust Bowl. That would have been a natural drought. So that's groundwater. Groundwater is percolating through the soil. Groundwater is percolating down. Think of water in coffee grounds. Don't think of some vast underground reservoir. It's not like there's a giant lake, you know, like deep under the mountains, and then like Smeagol in the lake just, ooh, my precious. Yes, my precious. No, that's not how groundwater works. No, groundwater is not my precious deep in underground lakes or Balrogs dropping in from above. No, that's not groundwater. Groundwater is just the percolation of water through the sediment, which means in ecosystems where bedrock is very close to the surface, it isn't a large groundwater reserve. It's just going to go off as runoff. So each one of these ecosystems, whether it has more biomass, closer to the surface bedrock, different types of soils, is going to change how much water stays here in land, how long that water stays there, and how available the water is to the plants that live there. So really look at the different types of ecosystems. If you want to take a little bit of a break and look at thunderstorms in the desert, you can go browse that a little while. You're going to see one big thing. The water comes out in a hurry, really flash floods. There's also a good reason to have those collecting pools of the water all around Lake Olympia, is that allows the water to percolate in rather than just pushing it out into the ocean. So there's the water cycle. Any questions? Post them in the comments. Phosphorus cycle. I'm not going to draw this one because there's a beautiful diagram right here. Marine sediment. Marine sediment is where most phosphorus is. That's the biggest reservoir of phosphorus is down in the marine sediment. So how do we get that? Well, plants need phosphorus. They get it from rocks. Marine sediments become rocks through the years and years of crushing down and pushing them in, and then they can actually be cycled into the sediment. It's going to be sedimentary rocks that way, and they're uplifted to make new mountain ranges, or they can go underneath the plate and come up as volcanoes. So that's how new phosphorus gets made. And this also tells you something about old rocks. So let's take for an example Australia. So Australia has very old rocks, very old soils. You would bet that they are low in phosphorus fertility. Case in point. Because the longer the rocks are there, the more the phosphorus is going to kind of leach off of the rock. So what we see there is that organisms are going to get phosphorus out of the soil and put it in organisms. So once it's in organisms, it can just walk away, wash away, or be hunted and shipped away. I don't know. But basically, it can leave the system. So this happens as fast as rocks degrade, which means that what degrades rocks? Well, lichens degrade rocks through lichen acids. Roots will very slowly degrade rocks. Acids will degrade rocks. So again, what is the sand like? What is the soil like? Is it acidic? How rocky is it? How deep are the rocks? This will tell you how much phosphorus is moving in and out of these. Now we use phosphorus in our bones. So calcium phosphate and various proteins are parts of our bones. So we need a good continuous amount of phosphorus. Plants do too. It's one of those NPK, those three things, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, that you apply to your fertilizers. So we do actually use fertilizer here. We'll get that in a second. So there's a flux between the organisms. That's really the largest flux, is organisms taking up phosphorus in the soil and returning it to the soil when they decompose. A lot of organisms don't decompose in the same place they take up phosphorus, and this allows for certain phosphorus movement. We'll go on to that later in section 5. We'll discuss movement. There is some atmospheric deposition, and there's a certain amount of ocean spray that will bring phosphorus out, but that's not really much compared to the mineable rock. And we do mine that rock. When we mine rocks that are high in phosphorus, we can use that to apply phosphorus to crops. in a very distant location. So moving phosphorus great distances is one way that humans impact the phosphorus cycle. Nitrogen. Most nitrogen is inert, unreactive, N2 in the air. 70% of the hot air coming out of my lungs is nitrogen. That's mostly nitrogen. And that's useless. The oxygen that I take in, that's reactive, and that will react with carbon to make CO2, you know, blah, 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 and it comes out when I blah, 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 blah. But nitrogen is an inert gas, and it doesn't do anything reaction-wise, which is why if you were to breathe in nitrogen gas for a long period of time in the absence of oxygen, you die, because you don't get any oxygen and nitrogen is not reactive. Now, there are some plants that utilize bacteria that can convert the nitrogen into nitrogenous compounds like ammonia, like nitrates and nitrites. And that's called nitrogen fixation. And it's compared to a process called denitrification. Denitrification. There's your spelling bee word right there. It's also on the slide right next to fixation. So denitrification is a process of turning those nitrates, nitrites, and ammonia back into nitrogen gas. If nitrogen gas is inert and it's a relatively low energy molecule, then an organism can get energy from taking NO3 and NO2 and turning it into just straight up N2. And that's how some organisms make their metabolism. Ammonia, NH3, or ammonium, NH4, they can both be oxidized. So there are organisms that can turn ammonia and ammonium into nitrates and nitrites, and there are organisms that can turn nitrates and nitrites into nitrogen gas. This is important if you're into a fish tank, which essentially isn't the whole world just one big fish tank? No, because no one's drizzling fish food in. So, no, but I drizzle fish food in to my fish tank at home. Back when I had a complex fish tank, what I had was, I had not an algae, but it's a flowering plant that looked very much like Cara from lab. And I would add nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in the form of fish food to these fish. They would ingest the fish food and they would excrete it as ammonia. Now, ammonia is toxic. If it gets to a high enough concentration in the water, it'll be toxic for the fish. Problem. Solve that problem by adding bacteria. So I added a certain type of bacteria to this, and you can buy it at a fish store. It's called denitrifying bacteria, what they actually are. It's a mix. Some of them turn the NH3 or NH4 ions into nitrates and nitrites. Well, that'll just turn your fish tank into nitric acid. That's not right. That's not right at all. So the nitrates and nitrites, however, can be converted both into plant matter and into nitrogen gas. So denitrifying bacteria had some of those in there, and they just bubble it out as nitrogen gas. So I add nitrogen in the form of fish food, and then I would allow the nitrogen to remove itself as nitrogen gas given the right bacteria. So that's good fish tank care. It's also important to note that I'd have to remove plant matter, because plants can take up ammonia or preferably nitrates and nitrites. So by allowing the plant to take up the nitrates and nitrites and also do some photosynthesis with the fish breath and fish CO2, I'd have to remove plant matter from that tank all the time. But I didn't have to clean my tank. It wouldn't accumulate ammonia because there are plants taking it up and there are bacteria turning it into nitrites. I wouldn't have to turn my tank more basic because there are plants using the nitrates and nitrites, and because there are bacteria that are taking up the nitrates and nitrites and turning them into N2. It's good fish tank care, and it really just replicates the nitrogen cycle. This isn't just a ramble about a fish tank. This is talking about the nitrogen cycle in microcosm. But we impact the nitrogen cycle. We use something called ammonium nitrate for agriculture. So for agriculture and industry, we use ammonium nitrate. I want to say it's actually this. I could be wrong. If I am, feel free to mock my chemistry in the comments section. The internet is a cruel place, isn't it? I deserve this for putting myself here. Anyway, we also have something called the Haber-Bosch process, where we take nitrogen and nitrogen and hydrogen gases and combine them under great pressures and under immense amounts of heat, and we get ammonia. We then take ammonia. We then take ammonia, turn it to ammonium, combine it with nitric acid to make ammonium nitrate. This is actually an exergonic process, so it gives off a certain amount of heat. There are icing packs that just use ammonium and nitrate. They mix it, they combine, it actually cools down. Kind of nifty. However, it can also be used to make explosives. So ammonium nitrate is an explosive. Feel free to look up Oklahoma City bombings. I mean, you can pause me and look up terrorist websites, but try not to look up how to make an ammonium nitrate bomb. We don't do that here. We don't do that here. No, we don't do that. So it's a high energy molecule though, and then ammonium nitrate gets pumped into the pumped in the soil by people who want to fertilize. The problem is, it's these molecules are very small. They tend to run off. So as you see there, runoff is about 36. 10 to the 12 grams. So big amounts are going to be coming off in runoff. And what this does is this nitrogen will actually go into the aquatic ecosystems and cause a plankton bloom, because nitrogen is also fertilizer for plankton, for algae. And these algae, as they grow, they will take in carbon dioxide. Yay, okay, we're solving global warming. No, we're not, because then they die. And when they die, they rot. And when they rot, they take up oxygen. And when they take up oxygen, they can deoxygenate a certain amount. So take a moment, yeah, sure. Go and look up Gulf of Mexico dead zone. Yeah, that's not a fun thing, is it? No, okay. So, did you look it up? No, go. I'll wait. I won't wait because I don't have to. There's no pause button for me. Okay, so the Gulf of Mexico dead zone comes basically as a result of nitrogen runoff because Americans use high amounts of ammonium nitrate to fertilize their crops, and it runs off. Consider as an alternative for your garden, instead of using ammonium nitrate, which you probably can't just buy directly, just use compost. Throw in some high quality nitrogen things like coffee grounds. You can get them free at Starbucks. You can get the used ones free at Starbucks. We still have enough nitrogen in there for fertilizer. All right, let's look about carbon. This is the one that gets kind of problematic. So the largest reservoir of carbon calcium carbonates and other carbonates in rocks. There's also a lot going on in the oceans. So the oceans are a very large pool of carbon because in the oceans, organisms use calcium and carbonate to make their skeletons. So you have calcium carbonate skeletons, which then precipitate out as diatomaceous earth, basically, and then those will turn into the sediments. Same kind of compression process, making carbonate rocks down at the bottom of an ocean floor. You can check out the White Cliffs of Dover. Those are an example of carbonate rocks that have come to the surface again. So that's where we get a lot of the uptake of carbon dioxide into the oceans. You can see uptake of CO2 by the oceans is slightly more than the oceans export to the atmosphere, which means the oceans are a net carbon sink. Good. Given enough time, any carbon problems in the planet will be taken care of by the oceans. Given enough time. Put too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, however, and the oceans become acidic, because not only is it calcium carbonate, but it's also carbonic acid. And carbonic acid and calcium carbonate tend to exist in this kind of dynamic equilibrium, but if you increase this reaction to the acid side by adding more and more acid, what that's going to end up doing is going to end up leaching calcium out. So unless you add a lot of calcium to the reaction, you're going to end up taking calcium out of calcium carbonate. What happens there is the shells of marine organisms just flat out dissolve. And when the organisms have no shells, they die. So too much acid in the oceans just kills the things that would take the carbon out of the oceans. Big problem, because then you've broken the way to get carbon out of the atmosphere. There is another way to get carbon out of the atmosphere, though. Photosynthesis, which is just a little more than respiration. There's generally just a little more gross primary productivity going in than there is total respiration coming out. So you see the soil respiration and plant respiration is about 120, and about 120 gross primary productivity. It's approximately equal, generally just, sometimes just a little more. If you increase the temperature, you can actually increase the soil respiration. So an increase in global temperature would increase the rate of soil respiration, which would mean it's greater than gross primary productivity. Doesn't that increase productivity too? Plants, when overheated, will not photosynthesize as much. So now if you increase the global temperature and increase the carbonic acid in the oceans, you basically get rid of most of the plant's ways of getting rid of carbon. Fossil fuel burning, destruction of vegetation, and deforestation add more carbon. But the big one here is fossil fuels. Add too much carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, and you acidify the oceans. Acidify the oceans, it's harder for the oceans to remove carbon from the atmosphere. Increase the temperature, which can happen if CO2 is a greenhouse gas, which it is. If you increase the temperature, the rate of deforestation goes up because a lot of trees aren't capable of living during higher temperature. The amount of evaporation goes up. Forest fires increase, which decreases the amount of vegetation. And there is the potential for a bit of a runaway there, where just the temperature goes up, the CO2 goes up, the temperature goes up, the CO2 goes up. This is a classic argument against global warming. You didn't think I'd go that way, but I'm going this way. Okay, it's an argument against global warming because people will say is global warming occurs because the amount of carbon dioxide occurs. What people will also say is the amount of carbon dioxide increases because of global warming. And you can look at the fossil record and you see the two are very tightly linked. So some people will say the carbon came after the warming. And some people will say the warming came after the carbon. And they're probably both right. It could be a bit of a system where warming increases the amount of carbon, which increases the amount of warming, which increases the amount of carbon. It's all about rates, though. Increase it too fast, and evolution can't occur to kind of change the amount of photosynthesis going on. So organisms that do photosynthesize better at high temperatures, they can also have an increase in this. There are ways of balancing them, but they're not fast ways of balancing them. One interesting fast way of balancing them, though, that's hypothesized is just to dump iron into the oceans. A lot of marine organisms are iron limited. You give them enough iron and they'll photosynthesize very much faster. If you do this in a deep ocean as opposed to the Gulf of Mexico, they photosynthesize, they get the carbon, they rain down into the deep ocean where there isn't enough respiration going on for them to create a dead zone. And if they did, it's the abyssal plain. It's not going to create much of a dead zone because there's nothing alive there to begin with. So it's one hypothesis about how to fertilize the oceans and decrease global warming. It's not okayed yet because it's completely mad science and you're just changing the entire globe's temperature. Other fluxes, more natural fluxes. So movement. Movement by animals. First off, just excretion. Excretion is a process by which by which nitrogen is removed from a body. So urea, ammonia, such like that. So that can also be nitrogen and phosphorus there. There's P in there. So there are some fish that have a high phosphorus requirements and low phosphorus excretion. Others, like this amphibian or other fish, have a low phosphorus requirement and low nitrogen to phosphorus excretion rates, which the organisms that are in an ecosystem will change the fluxes of nitrogen and phosphorus through the ecosystem. Burrowing. They're actually all going to be nitrogen and phosphorus right here, but burrowing is going to move low nitrogen soils up to the surface. Those low nitrogen soils may contain more rocks, which would contain more phosphorus. And you can see here that's a picture of a Masonic pocket gopher hole on campus, and you can see on it there are these little plants. Oh, you can't see me move the mouse because, oh, I've been forgetting to say move slide forward. I'm not recording this whole thing again. Okay. It's a picture of a gopher hole here with plants on it, and the plants that are on that are actually, it's a plant called vetch. Vetch is a nitrogen fixer, so it grows best in soils that have a low amount of nitrogen. This gopher burrow has soil that has a low amount of nitrogen, therefore the vetch grows better on that than the grasses. The grasses require a higher amount of nitrogen than the vetch. So that can change this microenvironment by changing the nitrogen amounts in the soil, because they're digging it from deeper. Okay, advanced slide. Sorry about that. Guano. If you look at that map that says Peru, Bolivia, and Chile, that map's not current, is it? That map has Bolivia with a coast, and Bolivia actually has part of the Atacama Desert. What happened here is this Guano cormorant would live in large colonies in that part of the Atacama Desert and would deposit its guano. Guano, bird poop, also bat poop. Guano has a high amount of nitrogen, phosphorus. And back in the days of earlier gunpowder, phosphorus from guano was a source of not only fertilizer, but also of the right phosphorus for gunpowder. So it was a strategic resource. Chile and Bolivia had a war over that part of the Atacama Desert. They fought a war over access to bird poop, because the birds were moving phosphorus from the ocean to the land in the form of their guano. And we're also making that phosphorus, which is relatively limiting to farming and relatively limiting to gunpowder at the time. They were making that phosphorus more available because it's more available than just dredging up a whole bunch of ocean creatures and burning them down for their phosphorus. So yeah, war over bird poop. Liberal arts education, you learn a little of everything. Fungi. Fungi have a large role in the carbon cycle, decomposition specifically. They also have roles in mutualism, bringing nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium back to the plants. So by bringing nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium back to plants in exchange for carbon, and by decomposing carbon in the cellulose and lignin, fungi influence the nitrogen, carbon, and potassium and phosphorus cycles. And organic matter doesn't accumulate in an ecosystem if there is more fungal activity, which is that soil respiration, remember. Soil respiration goes up when there are higher temperatures because there's higher fungal growth. Advanced slide. So I've been inconsistent about that. Decomposition rates, yeah. Amount of moisture does matter. The carbon to nitrogen ratio of what is being decomposed does matter. So wood has a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio than bark. Wood has a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio than food wastes. That's more nitrogen in it. So, for example, if I were to drop in some tree branches to my compost, they will degrade more slowly than the remainder of the compost because they have a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio, so that's going to affect their decomposition rate. Lignin is also in there, and other secondary compounds like cellulose or like pine sap. So these things are also present in the wood, and that's going to change the rate of decomposition for the negative. So certain things are going to decrease the rate of decomposition. Another thing is the type of worms. So worms are not native here. Anywhere that's had recent glaciation doesn't have native worms because worms don't live under glaciers. They had to move. They're often moving a little slowly because they're worms. So the worms I have in my compost are cycling the nitrogen and potassium away from foodstuff into, well, worm feces. And the worm feces can then be used by the plants as a source of nitrogen and potassium, especially when the fungi that I have in my garden can return it to the plants. So you see there, leaves as also with a higher lignin content being a hard to digest form of carbon. These are going to have a much slower decomposition rate than things with a lower lignin content, such as ash, cherry, and alder. This is an easy experiment to do. You just take a whole bunch of leaves, put them in a little bag, and throw that bag into the stream. And not a plastic bag, but like a mesh bag. And then you weigh the leaves beforehand. I should probably mention that. It's important. You weigh the leaves beforehand. You put them in the bag. Then you throw the bag in the stream. Then you bring the leaves out. You dry them down. You weigh them again. And the amount they weigh less is how much they have decomposed. You can do a daily mass loss by dividing this total mass loss by the number of days that these have been decomposing. Advanced slide. There's a roll of microbiota here. I've got a couple of videos on YouTube for you to enjoy. This is a video on YouTube for you to enjoy. I imagine you probably won't enjoy this one as much as you'll enjoy those ones, so I'll take a break and I'll let you browse those YouTube videos. So what do I do while they're paused? Oh wait, they come right back. Oh yeah, welcome back. Advanced slide. Nutrient flow. Ah yes, human influences on nutrient flow. First off, deforestation. So deforestation decreases the amount of carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus, as well as water, that are present in an ecosystem. Here's a good example. What happened here is there's this concrete dam in the weir that's allowing us to measure the amount of water that's coming off, and also take little samples of that water to see what nutrients are coming off. And that concrete dam is at the base of this mountain range here in New Hampshire, I want to say. All of that space that has been deforested, all that water flows through that one little dam. What they saw was they cut the trees back in 1965, and the nitrate concentration that ran off was over 10 times, over 20 times, up to 30 times, close to 40 times higher in the deforested area than in the control. So the amount of nitrogen just lost in the ecosystem during deforestation was much higher than the amount of nitrogen that would normally be lost. Now hold on. Now I'm not going to demonize Weyerhaeuser. Not on this channel, not when it's public. So replanting, reduce this. So this is just clear cut. A clear cut plus replanting, especially within a very short amount of time, like 18 months mandated for local forestry companies, can decrease the nitrogen loss. Also, what you can do is you can decrease the flow off of the ecosystem after this by not just removing all of the trees, but removing most of the trees for timber. Removing all of the trees means all the water leaves. Removing most of the trees means most of the water leaves. Not removing the undergrowth means less of the water leaves. So allowing things like salal, trailing blackberries, ocean spray, sword ferns. I'm just going to look out the window and name everything that's just like right there because I'm in the lab still because the computer ain't working. But yeah, all those like undergrowth plants, you allow them to stay, the amount of nitrogen runoff actually goes down a bit. Now it still goes up when you deforest, and clear cutting does do a lot of damage. But allowing that slash to kind of fall back down, so the parts that aren't the bole of the tree, allowing them to fall down, they can actually reduce the amount of runoff too because they're wood. And see earlier about the retention of water during wood. Well, when wood is present. During wood, glad we're close to the end here. Carbon cycle. We're basically screwing it up. By burning fossil fuels, we're increasing the amount of carbon going into the atmosphere. Full stop. By deforesting, we're decreasing the amount of carbon coming out of the atmosphere. Full stop. Changing land use by deforestation and not replanting is really bad for the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. It increases it too much. One way we can actually get rid of this is the aforementioned forestry. Wood that isn't being degraded is a carbon sink. Plants, when they're younger, actually have a higher amount of carbon fixation and have a higher net ecosystem productivity. So hypothetically, what you could do is you could plant a whole bunch of young Douglas fir trees and harvest them about every 80 years, and all that carbon that is now in the wood has been removed from the atmosphere. They grow fastest when they're youngest. So harvesting these 80-year-old Douglas fir trees and turning it into a product that would not be biodegrading, say lumber, timber, building materials, this is going to put carbon out of the atmosphere and into your homes. Now, turning it into biofuel, like I do at my stove at home, is just cycling the carbon, and isn't the best thing, but better than coal power plants because I'm not adding new carbon, I'm just cycling carbon through. So there are reasons for biofuel. Biofuel isn't really a good potential for very large power plants though. And removing carbon by trees is a very slow process. But there are ways that humans can positively impact the carbon cycle. So make good carbon-friendly choices. And don't go on flights, which you probably shouldn't be doing anyway, because if classes are canceled due to the coronavirus, you probably shouldn't be going on flights. Airplanes release a lot of carbon dioxide. That's a human impact to the carbon cycle right there. Advanced slide. That's the end for today. So that's the first 3 lectures. I recorded all of these on Tuesday. I'm going to come back tomorrow and record a few more. Put comments down in the comment section, and we can maybe use different methods of recording. I know this is a relatively long lecture, but hey, 37 minutes down here on the clock means it's not as long as a 50-minute lecture. I miss you guys in class. If it's Friday and you haven't been here all week, you know, I am really missing you because you guys bring a real positive experience to my daily life. And let's hope this doesn't last too long. So I'll be recording videos for the second week after spring break because I anticipate if we're going to be closed, we're going to be closed 2 weeks. I'll also be taking suggestions on alternate methods of delivery for this material. But until then, Bodie out.